All right. Good afternoon. Welcome back. Let's get started for today. So I hope that you're having a good week. Today, we are continuing where we left off, talking about some of the ways in which we use online communication to talk about science and health, and also some of the ways that we work with providers and experts in health and medicine as it relates to using online sessions. So we spent a lot of time last class discussing how patient-provider relationships happen online, the use of telehealth and online medicine to provide forms of support. We also talked about some of the limitations that this has too, right? You can't get the same as a physical examination, and there might be certain barriers with access to an internet connection or trying to pick up on information online that aren't present in the same way face-to-face. So we'll be shifting gears and talking a little bit more about media, including mass media's role in communicating about and educating us regarding science and health issues, as are talked about in the two articles that I'm asking you to look at for this week. So we'll unpack those two articles, explore some of their core ideas in a little bit more detail. So getting going on stuff for today, we also took some time in Monday's class to talk about the health disparities presentation. And I shared the schedule for that assignment so that you know when I'm asking you to share. We also talked about some of the ways that we convey health information online and what it means to do so successfully. So as a review, what involves the use of devices such as tablets or phones to promote good health? Yes. So mHealth, right, is an example of this. And the differences between something like eHealth and mHealth, you can think about mHealth being a little bit more automated, right? It's like the app on your phone that tracks the number of steps that you take, or maybe you have something like a Fitbit or something that's designed to monitor and let you know about healthy behavior, such as a calorie counter, right? Whereas the usage of eHealth is a more active exchange where you're doing things such as an appointment that happens remotely, right? So in this way, the sort of automated, algorithmically designed apps about health are designed to encourage healthy behaviors. A more contemporary example of this is a lot of cities and towns have started to create active information where they track your location and let you know if you were at potential risk of contracting COVID-19. That'd be an example of mHealth as well. So just as a reminder, the presentation schedule, as it is listed, has that Monday and Wednesday as the presentation dates in that order. So the presentations are 6 to 8 minutes. So there's an opportunity for everybody to go at those times. I also wanted to take the opportunity to talk a little bit more about the presentation rubric. I posted that after class on Monday, but I just wanted to walk through that in a little bit more detail, just to be as transparent as possible about how I'm grading this presentation and what I'm looking for this assignment. So overall, this assignment is out of 200 points, or 20% of your grade, adds up to 1,000 points total, making up your grade. So one of the things that I'm looking for is for you to turn in a 1 to 2 page outline prior to your presentation date, at least 24 hours ahead of time. And the idea of the outline is that it's a bullet pointed guide that you can use as you're working through the presentation, especially since you're in that 6 to 8 minute range. There's a good chance that you'll have some ground to cover, and I don't want you to have to memorize content fully. So an outline you can think about as kind of a lifeline to help you out as you're working through. You can look through the next point in the outline and be like, okay, I know what I need to cover next. And it's a way to keep track of your notes and to remind yourself what you intend to cover in the presentation. I encourage you to print out or have it like on your phone as you prepare for your presentation. I'm looking for complete sentences and just making sure that the outline itself matches the main points that you cover. Doesn't need to be exact or verbatim, but that it represents the main ideas. The other thing that I'm looking for is the presentation itself. So the presentation in terms of content needs to be 6 to 8 minutes. I recommend timing yourself, seeing if you're within that range and adjusting the amount of content that you have based on that. That you're engaging in a health or science topic that disproportionately impacts a particular culture or demographic. Again, we've looked through some examples talking about the impact of cancer on African-American communities, talking about HIV/AIDS and its impact on members of the LGBT+ community and so on. Those are examples of health disparities, and you all took some time to explore those as well. It could be the same topic as your annotated bibliography, and you choose to expand on that in more detail, or you could choose a different topic if there's something else that you would rather cover. And then as far as the last thing I'm looking at, it's overall your engagement, right? So are you really exploring and telling us about that topic, including what you've learned, what you've researched through exploring that? Are you showing how a population has been affected? And then as an important component of this assignment, I'm asking you to not only explain who's been impacted by this issue, but also to identify communication strategies that could support or help that population that's being affected, right? So for instance, you might say that older Americans are disproportionately at risk of being targeted by health insurance scams or health insurance misinformation. One way to support people that might be targeted is to provide things like brochures or pamphlets or other pieces of information on how to spot scammers and what you should do if you receive something that seems like it might be a scam call, right? So that sort of here's the problem and here are potential solutions are ways that you can incorporate what we've talked about in the class on good health communication strategies for this assignment as well. And again, I'm not looking for your public speaking quality or anything like that. This isn't a public speaking course, but just that you come in feeling prepared and ready to go. I know that not everybody is thrilled about public speaking or presenting in a group, but you're sharing among your colleagues. And also, I'm happy to, if you want to do a practice run with me prior to the class, to give you feedback on that as well. So that's there. The other thing that I wanted to point you to, since people noted that the quiz last week was not accessible, is on Monday, I updated so that now there is a merged quiz, right? The quiz covers content both from last week, so week 3, as well as this week. And it's just 2 essay questions. The first question asking you to look at the week 3 readings, including preps and week 3 from the textbook. And then this week, talking about the new pre-content. Again, I apologize for the quiz not showing up, but that will cover all the ground that we need for those. All right. Any questions about the presentation? Anything we talked about in class? Anything else? So for today, right, we're shifting gears to talk about those 2 articles. And what we'll be looking at are ways in which media and online content are used by us in order to receive health information that we use on a regular basis. Also, right, how COVID-19 in particular has taught us a lot of things already about health and science communication and ways that we can promote healthy behavior online, right? There's a good chance that you will find yourself needing to engage with patients if you're going in that professional field who are going to have information they receive online that you have to wade through with them. There's a good chance that you might be providing health or science information online. Or if that's not the track you're going down, I think that understanding how this information is shared and circulated online is a core element of how we communicate about a range of topics, right? we've talked about and we've mentioned COVID-19 a bit in this class. Obviously, it's very much ongoing in terms of its discussion, its impact, the way that it's communicated. And I definitely recognize that it's become a super politically heated and charged topic, particularly as it relates to policy related to vaccination, face masks, closure and remote work and so on. So I don't approach this from an ideological perspective, but instead from in the context of COVID-19, there is a significant amount of misinformation and disinformation that was conveyed from a variety of sources, including sources that were public, like regular people's accounts and information through media, and also through scientific study and work that turned out not to be accurate and needed to be recounted, right? And there is an array and mix of how we can identify and source sources of mis and disinformation that I think are all worth exploring and understanding to get a better sense of the landscape that we find ourselves in currently. So as kind of a way to get us thinking about and engaging in some of those issues, right? One of the major ways in which information about health and science and a variety of social and political topics is shared online is, of course, through the use of social media accounts. And one thing that I found really surprising and interesting was a study that was conducted and had an associated quiz that you could take that came from Clemens University and in their media studies department. And I was taking the quiz myself, and I actually found it to be kind of challenging. So I wanted to share this quiz and work through a bit of it together because I think it offers interesting insights into how we might receive and identify information that we see online as accurate or inaccurate. So this comes from Clemson University, and the way that this quiz works is it asks you to determine whether somebody's social media account is real and is the real person they're claiming to be, or is like a troll or a bot or not a real account. So a fake social media account is oftentimes used to spread misleading or incorrect information. There's a total of 8 profiles. So I'll scroll through each of them, and then I'll ask people to vote one way or the other on whether or not this is a real profile. So we have here Chloe Evans on Twitter. It's all going to hell, hashtag dead horse, who's responsible, talking about these plant explosions. Brittany, capacity to prove, even with scared half to death. Be a model, don't ask what the meaning of life is. Maturity is a bitter disappointment, for Vonnegut. So here's this profile and some of the posts from Chloe, who's a student, seems to be living in Atlanta. All right, so how many people think that this is a troll profile? Okay, how many people think that this is a legit profile? Okay, kind of in between. So this is a troll account. Chloe was a Russian-made troll account. Hundreds of Twitter accounts like Chloe's were active through 2014 and 15. An automated effort through an agency based in St. Petersburg, and there's an analysis into that in more detail. So kind of an interesting example, right, of how something could be a little bit hard to determine. So some of the ways that these accounts could be identified are through events that didn't actually happen. So this story about this chemical plant thing was actually photoshopped. Interesting thing to know that you wouldn't necessarily trace the first time around. So profiles of women in their 20s are oftentimes used in incorrect social media accounts. All right. Next up, we have Harmony. I should mention they use a variety of political orientations to highlight this. This doesn't just come from one perspective. So college girl who managed to stay conservative. Second account for sharing social and political views. Variety of discussions surrounding voter issues, policy. Discussions surrounding immigration. and immigration-related issues. Discussion surrounding First Lady at the time. So this person clearly has a very politically oriented account. How many folks think this is a real account? Troll account? Okay, most people think that it's a troll account. Okay. So yes, this is also a troll account. Although, right, there are a lot of people that have very politically associated accounts online that are actually the real accounts. So one thing that's a good way to track the accuracy of online information is the quantity of personal information, right? A lot of accounts that are not accurate generally have just like no information outside of a political or social issue that they're choosing to share. So there's like little information about family, schoolwork, friends, pets, and so on that's shared. That's oftentimes a telltale indicator. And also the retweeting of sources from like major political candidates or political leaders are examples of troll accounts as well. All right. So next we have Christopher, who lives in Indiana. Also has very politically oriented messages. Also some photos, the tractor, usage of religious imagery here. Also some points related to COVID-19. So how many folks think this is a real profile? Troll account? Okay. So yes, this would be a real account, right? So oftentimes, right, when we see a mix of perspectives, including things shared about like science or health-related issues, combined with personal like things like personal photos and so on, that's usually a good indicator that that's a real person, right? As they identify these posts about life, like going to places to eat, are good examples. Also, right, the idea that using humor and not necessarily sharing views that are entirely partisan are ways to identify if an account is real. All right. So there's another post here about power to women, right? Again, accounts that might be false are not limited to a political party or orientation. So there's this account here, sharing content and quotations, including those from Bernie Sanders, discussion of the Women's March, issues of women's health. Real account? Troll account? Yeah, so this is a troll account, right? So again, we see these from a variety of different signs and orientations here. The idea that there was no clear organization or like actual institution here. Oftentimes, if there's no person that seems to be behind the group, but that follows other groups, that can be a good indicator, right? There's not actually a person running the group. That can be a good sign. For or against, right? Taking on extreme positions on views is an example of that as well. Number 5, you've got Amy, no bad vibes. Daughter, sister, proud Black American. I tend to get political. Discussion about COVID-19, some circulation again of political leaders and policy-related issues. Do we think this is a real profile? Fake profile? Okay. So this is a troll account. So again, this is an example of an account not being legitimate. Interestingly, the usage of accounts that pretend to be left-leaning Black women are especially common, right? Obviously, that is not every account, but there's some interesting trends in that direction. So interesting sign, mimicking users who are actually a part of a political community. So there was an interesting case that actually came up a while back in which there was a professor who posted an account that was talking about the experiences of being like a Black woman in chemistry, but it turned out that the person, the professor who had the Twitter account, was white, right? So there are some cases in which people will use what is known as digital blackface, right? Or of lying about things like race through the use of online accounts, which is a problem for a lot of reasons. Fanning the flames is not limited to a single political party either. So there's this profile here, scholar, journalist, and activist at Rutgers, talking about public policy and police-related issues. Talking again, it seems, in a left-leaning context about political issues. We think it's a real account, fake account. Okay, seeing a few more hands for the legit. So this is a real person, right? So some of the signs here, the identifiable information, right? You can find out whether or not this one person was actually a professor at Rutgers, which is a good way to verify the accuracy. Local focus, right? Oftentimes, people who are a little bit, or people are more likely to be real accounts if they actually are posting about local topics or issues. National topics tend to be more commonly done by trolls. We have Nevada Blue Line. This is a profile that is supportive of police and law enforcement. Talking about police dogs, police policy, and so on. Real account? Fake account? Huh. So not a real one. The divisive affinity group, again, the for or against us is an interesting frame. So Nevada, right, is a major swing state in the US. Nevada oscillates kind of left and right, depending on the political season or year. And oftentimes, especially on political issues, this is a very common tactic used as well. And then lastly, we've got Mike, known as the Health Ranger, who's a consumer health advocate. That's pretty relevant to this class. Talking about US brands, Sprouts good for the health, geoengineering. Think about it. I'm not quite sure what to think about because we can't see the post. But they've apparently given these people a lot to think about. Wheatgrass. Is this a real account? Fake account? Seems a little divided, although I did see more troll hands up. This is a real account, right? So this is the creator of the website Natural News. So a sign of a real account. Sometimes people will share inaccurate information, including inaccurate information about health, because they're trying to advertise and gain attention for something like their website, right? Also, if there are multiple removed posts, there's a good chance that is impacting the trustworthiness of the source too. So based on kind of the majority votes here, we did a pretty good job in identifying these. And I wanted to do this, again, to highlight that misinformation and disinformation online is definitely something we've seen on a lot of social and political issues. But especially when we think about health and science is a super relevant consideration. That oftentimes how we receive information about health and science is through online circulation, through the use of accounts, and I think our ability to identify and track the accuracy and trustworthiness of some of these profiles that we see circulating information, right? Including somebody that has a personal page about how they're advertising their own health solutions or websites are important considerations here because there's this ongoing challenge as it relates to the use of correct and accurate information online. So I thought it'd be a fun way for us to start thinking about this a little bit more. So getting started first with this Meatley and Fair's piece on the quote infodemic, right? The purpose of this article and thinking about this in the course broadly and maybe the work that you would do for your health disparities presentation is to think about both mis and disinformation using the case study of COVID-19, right? And mis and disinformation are two different things, and we'll break those down a little bit. And I think what this study gives us is a set of suggestions about how to promote positive behavior in a more general sense, right? And again, I think we can find spaces to critique or push back against any of the articles that we've talked about in this class. But the thesis that is put out by this article is the idea that an infodemic is as damaging as a pandemic, right? And we can dispute and discuss this a little bit more, but it's this idea that if inaccurate information about health is shared, that it has significant impacts on our well-being in a way that exists external to the actual material risk that the condition might have. So as mentioned, right, I think that this Venn diagram is a really good way to think about how information is divided up and talked about. So information that is false fits in this general category of misinformation, right? So if somebody shares from The Onion, right? The Onion is a satirical news site that shares headlines of events that don't actually happen and aren't real. And there have been times in which political leaders will cite from or quote from The Onion thinking that it actually happened. And we're like, well, no, it's The Onion. For instance, there was a case in which there was a story about Jerusalem being bombed, which didn't actually happen at the time, but The Onion wrote it as an article and people actually cited from it thinking that it really did happen. That's in the realm of misinformation, right? Malinformation could be correct information, could be accurate and true, but it's shared with the intent to harm somebody else. One example of this is in like interpersonal relationships, when people do what's called like a last shot, where they say something insulting to a relationship that they know is ending. For instance, two people are breaking up and one person loudly yells, "I never liked you anyway," right? Or by the way, your taste in music is stupid, right? It's malinformation, not because it's incorrect, but because it's intended to harm somebody else, right? Meanwhile, in the middle here is disinformation. So disinformation is both incorrect and also intended to hurt other people. Again, if we think about some of the ways in which like somebody is trying to do like a health insurance fraud scheme, like they say, hey, we have this miracle cure that'll cure your cancer, just give us your social security number, right? That would be an example of a disinformation campaign, right? So I think differentiating those two and recognizing that misinformation, somebody sharing a story that's incorrect without necessarily intending to harm, but really genuinely believing that it was real, is very different than an intentional choice to share inaccurate information, and that we've seen both at play on a range of health and science-related issues, right? You might think back to the Tuskegee syphilis study and the way that this information was given, right, to participants in the study who were told that they would be receiving a cure and support, but never received penicillin. So when we think about media and its relationship to health, right, one thing that I think is important is if media is covering a whole range, it's covering things like our access to news, whether it's through websites, whether it's through television, or the usage of smaller videos or snippets, whether it's the use of advertisements or things that show up at the top of our feeds, right? Or whether it's like having a family member who continues to receive the paper news every day, right? Media provides windows for us to access public health information. That is, if you have tracked things like COVID-19 case rates and you're curious about how case rates are going in particular locations, or maybe making decisions about your own travel related to COVID-19, right? You're using that broader information and assessing that information to make personal choices. CDC recently announced that they are lifting mask requirements for airplanes, right? That's an example of us becoming aware of and maybe changing our plans based on the information that we've received. Additionally, media contributes to changing attitudes or opinions about health, right? So if we think all the way back to 2020, one of the most common phrases that was uttered and circulated through media was the phrase flatten the curve, right? Feels like an eternity ago that we heard that, but that was continuously used to discuss COVID-19. And that narrative very much shifted as the sort of severity and approach to COVID changed as well. And the idea here is that media are effective and work when they convey strong and very clear communication about health, right? When it's intentional and when it's clear as to what somebody should or should not do. For example, right, the usage of campaigns related to health as it relates to things like wearing a seatbelt, like using lines such as click it or ticket, are examples of very specific communication strategies. And as a result, right, the vast majority of people do regularly use seatbelts. So we can see a lot of the campaigns surrounding seatbelt policy have been very effective about those issues. So I think one thing to think about here is, we talked about social media accounts. They're not necessarily accurate, right, and could lead to incorrect information about health and science being circulated. But I think one thing that I alluded to on Monday that is useful for us to really revisit and really think about is what the process of scientific study and research looks like, right? When people have like debates in the comments section of the internet, a lot of times people will say things like, do your research, right? Or share or post articles, and oftentimes feels like people are speaking entirely different languages when they talk about the information or data that they have to back up their claims or points, right? And given that, especially in the context of COVID-19, I think it's useful to back up and to think about what the goal of science, science communication, and health communication are, right? The purpose of why historically, going all the way back to even before the Greeks, right, that we did science was that we were trying to understand more about the world, right? Purpose of doing an experiment or study is to create generalizable data, right? To add to sort of the overall like cloud of knowledge that we have, and to just make that cloud bigger and bigger, the more studies and work that we do, right? That's the goal. And we see to varying degrees whether or not scientific studies actually meet that goal, right? So one major concern then that comes in and doing research and doing scientific study about issues related to health, science, COVID-19, and an array of issues is considering ethics, right? What is right and wrong to do? Clearly, there was a major ethical problem in Tuskegee syphilis and of miseducating people about the results of the study and how they would be assessed. If you've heard of the Stanford prison experiment, that was a case in which people were assigned to be either prisoners or inmates. Another case where the psychological damage from that study was a major ethical challenge. And we talked last week about the use of placebos, right, or fake medications that don't actually cure the issue, and that being a potential ethical issue too. So ethics has always been at the forefront of how we do research and understand science and health. And a major consideration here that is a check against unethical study and research, right, are these ideas of validity and reliability. You might have heard if you've taken another science class or even a class that engages in the study of research. So the idea here is that if a study is ethical, if the study is done well, the idea is that other people should be able to do the study and get the same results, right? That ideally, a study works and is effective when it can be proven and replicated. In other words, validity would mean that a study is internally consistent, right? So a study can be valid if it's able to make sense for itself, if it hits the target for the bullseye, right? For instance, if kind of in the early stages, the vaccine for COVID-19 is being tested, right? The vaccine would have high validity if it was able to prevent contraction of COVID-19 or lessening of its worst symptoms, right? Reliability means that regardless of how valid or correct the results are, that you get the same thing every time, right? So in this way, you could be reliable, but not valid, right? You're getting the same result. The result is off base, something isn't working. You could get something that's neither of those, it's kind of all over the place, or you're getting something that's consistently hitting the bullseye, where it's both valid and reliable, right? The reason that that's important is because when scientists conduct study and do research on science and health, it needs to be both reliable and valid, right? And people will triangulate or cross-check or verify the study in order to see if they're getting the same results themselves, right? If they're not, then there's a good chance that something went wrong in the process and the study is not reliable or valid, right? And there are a number of reasons why inaccurate information could be shared. One of them is that sometimes, right, scientists will unfortunately unethically cook the books, right? They'll make and invent data that doesn't actually exist and use that for the study, right? And in doing so, checking and verifying, you discover, this is not data that we have, right? Another reason is just that something went wrong, right? It's not intentional, but something was missing in the process. So one way of thinking about this is to think about sort of the overall peer review process, right? As I mentioned last class, this is an important consideration when we think about how we receive online information about science. If we're circulating that a new study has come out regarding COVID-19, then it's important for us to think about how that study was created and what that study does, right? If a study is advertising a medical treatment or intervention that can actually worsen symptoms or has a ton of side effects, we need to take that with a grain of salt. So we study something, right? Scientists and people who work on that project create that project, right? They create a manuscript that is the written study. They submit it to a journal, right? For instance, the journal Nature or the journal Health Communication are examples of this. The editor of that journal sends it out for what's called peer review, right? Peer review being experts in the field or what are considered to be professional colleagues who provide feedback and make a decision about whether or not this is a good study and is worth working through. Oftentimes, significant revision is needed, so the scientists will go back, they'll incorporate the peer edits and comments, work through that entire process, right? And once the peer reviewers decide that an article is up to snuff and meets the standards, then the article is then published in the journal. So the entire process of doing this can take anywhere between several months, a year, to even multiple years. I've had things that have been under review for a very long time, right? Depending on the ability to get reviewers and how long the reviewers take. So it's a very long process. And the purpose of this process is to ensure that the ultimate article that we get at the end of things is a quality piece, right? It is correct, has been verified, is reliable, and is valid, and is information that we can widely use. The problem is that there have been some shortcuts and ways that this process has not been fully met and realized. For instance, pictured here is an article that was retracted that was talking about the ability of possible treatments for COVID-19. I'm not going to even attempt to pronounce what this is, but right, this was discussed a lot in the news as a potential medical solution for COVID-19. And as you can see, this was published in June of 2020, knowing that we reached pandemic status in the United States in March of 2020. It was very fast. But it says here, after publication of our Lancet article, right, several concerns were raised to the veracity of data and analyses conducted along with the authors. We launched an independent third-party review and with the consent to evaluate the database and confirm the completeness of the database and to replicate the analysis, again, testing the reliability. And we were informed that information could not transfer to the full data set, client contracts, and the report, that this would violate client agreements and confidentiality. In other words, we were not able to independently and privately review and evaluate the validity and accuracy of this piece. So this piece was advertising a potential solution or way to cure or address COVID-19 symptoms, but the results of the study could not be replicated or proven, and therefore the study was withdrawn, right? Showing us some of the examples and possible consequences of this entire process. And then the other thing that I wanted to highlight here related to this, and while this video presents it in a very positive way, I want you to think a little bit critically here about the idea of preprint that also impacts this entire process too.
A scientist's job is to obtain knowledge about the natural world. Sharing that knowledge is critical for scientific progress, as new information produced by one scientist can be used by others to make new discoveries and further benefit society. In 1665, the Royal Society of London created the first scientific journal called Philosophical Transactions to facilitate the transmission of new scientific findings. This publishing model established the concept of peer review to ensure scientific quality and the defined date of publication to establish priority of discovery. These principles have laid the foundation for the nearly 30,000 scientific journals that exist today. Let's see how the process works. First, scientists write a manuscript and send it to a journal for consideration. If the editors are interested, it is sent out to a group of anonymous scientists for their opinion of the quality of the work. The journal receives commentaries from the reviewers and decides whether to accept or reject the manuscript, or commonly requests revisions that require more experiments, resubmission, and re-review before the journal makes a final decision. This process works, but it takes time. It's not uncommon for studies to be published 1 year after initial submission. In addition, excellent work can be rejected on the basis of its perceived importance. Are there better ways biologists can share information? Biology may learn a thing or two from the physicists. In 1991, Paul Ginspar revolutionized communication among physicists by producing a preprint server called arXiv that allows for rapid communication among scientists. arXiv now posts more than 100,000 papers each year. Preprint servers in the life sciences exist, but they are not yet widely used. A preprint server is simple. A scientist uploads the manuscript to a server. The paper is screened to ensure its scientific nature. Within a few days, the manuscript is posted online and becomes visible to the entire scientific community before peer review. Subsequently, the manuscript is usually submitted to a traditional journal for peer review and publication. Most, but not all journals will accept work previously posted on a preprint server. The immediate access of the preprint has many advantages. Preprint servers give the authors feedback from a larger group of people than the anonymous peer reviewers. Preprints can be an announcement of a discovery, which helps scientists establish priority of their work. With preprints, authors can share work in progress or recent accomplishments with funding agencies, promotion committees, or future employers. Preprints are open access. Anyone in the world with an internet connection can view the manuscript for free. Preprints accelerate scientific progress by speeding up access to new findings. The internet is continuing to redefine how people access information and create social networks. Using the internet, physicist Paul Ginspar tried the first truly new experiment in scientific communication since the creation of the philosophical transactions 350 years ago.
So I wanted to share this video to highlight the idea of a preprint as a pretty significant change in the way that we use articles, right? So we talked about the kind of traditional process of peer review, the idea that that takes time, takes review from experts, and we know then that the piece that we receive at the end is credible and overall should be trusted. What the preprint process has meant, though, is that while it does give a larger audience while a piece is still being worked on, that the preprint is still widely accessible and available for people to read, comment, and talk about, right? So, for instance, if somebody is reading a preprint like this one, talking about how there is the potential for a medical treatment for COVID-19, right? And they read it as a preprint and think to themselves, great, this is a new study that came out. Excellent, right? There's a good chance that person is not familiar with what a preprint means or what the preprint means for the validity of that information. And that is meant in the context of COVID-19, that information that is still in the preprint phase that has not been reviewed by experts in the field is being kind of shared and circulated as if it's factual, right? And that's a problem as we think about the accuracy of information that we receive on, right? So it's important for us to think critically here about misinformation, about the idea that while misinformation can come from media and political outlets, it can come from public and accounts shared online, whether they're real or troll accounts. It can also come from failures that happen in the process of doing health and science research. There's a lot of good stuff out there, but there are also a lot of studies that have been retracted or withdrawn or ultimately are inaccurate. So in the context of COVID-19, this article identifies a few pieces that were meant to address mis and disinformation. Some of these included the use of open access content. Oftentimes, a lot of scientific articles and information, this is a major issue, right, are locked behind paywalls. You might be surprised to learn that with very rare exception, if we publish research in a journal, we do not make a cent, right? The actual researchers and people do not make any money from that. It's the publishers that do, right? Because the publishers are the ones that profit from information being circulated online. But because oftentimes articles are locked behind paywalls, it can be difficult for people to receive health and science information, and it adds to the disparities in access to quality information too, right? In fact, one of the ways that we get access to information has been because, as students at EOU, you all have access to the EOU library database. You can access articles, and EOU pays for subscriptions, right, that the general public would not necessarily get. Also, some of the other efforts include organizations such as the World Health Organization within the United Nations that created a site that's considered like a Mythbusters site surrounding things related to COVID-19. And the United Nations also created an online COVID-19 portal, right, talking about sort of information, questions that people had about COVID-19. Does drinking alcohol prevent COVID-19? I sure wish it did. And some of these things here, talking about common questions or issues. The idea here being that if things are presented as infographics, are presented in a dynamic way with common questions and information that to factually resolve those questions, that it would be able to resolve and address major health issues or topics that came up for people, right? So those are examples of some of the public efforts that have been done to try to deal with and address COVID-19 and information regarding COVID-19. So why don't we go ahead and take a break? And when we come back from the break, I'm going to have us take some time to explore and talk about what these authors suggest as a plan to combat sources of misinformation that we can think about in the context of COVID. We can also think about more broadly surrounding a variety of health and science issues that we know might be subject to inaccurate information. So let's go ahead and reconvene at about 3 or so, 3 or a little before, So feel free to use the restroom, grab a drink, do what you need, and we'll come back to talk about this as well as some key points from the other article as well.
There's like no camp, no camp, one away from that. And then I go and then I live a miserable job. Wait, like the thing where it's supposed to like, isn't it not easy to like, dude, I'm not gonna, I can't, like, I have nothing to do if I don't have. Like, I try to do it. I try to do it. Yeah, I'm just gonna say like, oh wait, we're allowed to say. So I'm gonna say I tried. Are you gonna?
All right. Looks like we've got everybody back. So let's go ahead and pick up where we left off here. So we were talking about sort of the use of mis and disinformation and talking about health and science broadly, but looking at the case study of COVID-19. So the authors pose sort of 12 different points for what they believe can combat misinformation and how information about health and science is communicated online. So I'm going to go through these, and as I'm talking about them, start to think for yourself whether or not you feel like these are persuasive or effective strategies, because I'll give you the opportunity in a group in just a little bit to talk about what you all see as maybe the most persuasive or effective of these strategies, or what might be missing here in terms of engaging with the public on accurate health-related issues. The first thing that's suggested here is to provide more exposure and airtime to medical professionals, scientists, and public health personnel to provide authentic, useful, and transparent information to the public. The thinking here is that if we provide people who have positions of authority and expertise on the issue, that those people will be able to address fears, and that the sort of ethos and experience and credibility that they bring to the table will be able to sort of cut through the noise and provide additional information. One kind of interesting case is that we see that the way that public health officials share and convey information, including those appointed by political leaders, are definitely not seen as neutral, right? For instance, there has been both praise and critique of Dr. Anthony Fauci and sort of his the kind of political connotation that that's brought about to. Promoting websites of public health organizations via search engines. So you do a search related to COVID-19 or a question related to COVID-19, and then ideally what pops up are things like the CDC or the World Health Organization or other groups that might be able to provide information related to the issue over something like a blog post. Right? Verifying the accounts of public health personnel on popular social media, right? So oftentimes apps such as Twitter will have the sort of check mark that the account is verified. And with what we saw earlier about sort of troll accounts, accuracy verification might be pretty important. Promoting the posts of public health and medical professionals, right? The idea here being that if there are official pages for medical or health experts, that those posts receive circulation, retweets, and are widely available or recommended. Monitoring engagement on social media platforms to control messages being delivered. So one example of this that we've seen has been sometimes social media will delete posts that they see as inaccurate or not posting correct information, or sometimes they'll give you a notification that you are sharing a post that you haven't clicked on and read the article for yet. So those might be examples. Establishing programs to help people cope with stress and address their mental health concerns, right? So mental health, as we talked about last class, has definitely become an even bigger concern that has been attempted to be addressed through things like telehealth and e-health. But programs that dealing with those impacts are especially important, especially when we think about sort of the policies related to COVID-19 and the human impact those have had. Adopting an empathic style of communication to get public attention and address health concerns, right? So an empathic or empathy-centered perspective would be sort of putting yourself in somebody else's position, imagining or dealing with the concerns or thoughts that somebody might have, right? So for instance, I'm trying to say, I understand where you're coming from. I understand that being diabetic is incredibly challenging with paying for insulin. So here's a program that's designed to make it more affordable. Promoting dialogue to better understand people's perceptions and the motives behind their practices, right? So in making what might be difficult health decisions, oftentimes people in health communication will do studies and interviews of people who might be doing behavior that we don't consider super healthy. For instance, if somebody is a very, very heavy smoker, right? That might be somebody that's studied and talked to in an interview to engage with dialogue to understand that experience and motivations, right? Including challenges associated with addiction. Sharing personal experiences on social media to combat misinformation. One thing that I've noticed that's been used a lot, especially in regards to information regarding COVID-19 vaccination, are sort of campaigns where people who are just sort of picked as regular people are sharing sort of their decisions on whether or not to get vaccinated and the motivations behind those decisions, and that those are targeted regionally, right? So sometimes when I'm watching an ad on YouTube, it'll be like somebody located in La Grande or in Baker City who's talking about that experience. Direct strategies toward minority populations and people of different classes, races, and ethnicities, right? So as we've talked about in health disparities, targeted advertisements and engagement can be a way to address those gaps. If you see yourself in what is being circulated and promoted through commercials, that can be one way of gaining support. And then increasing research and development of health communication to explore and understand targeting of different populations. So again, it's this idea that we need to know more and we need to conduct sort of further research and understanding of these populations, right? So these are sort of the 12 strategies that are proposed. We've seen some of them in action already. Some of them are sort of still developing in the context of COVID-19, but these are also things that we could see on a range of other topics too. So what I'm going to ask you to do is take some time in small groups, and based on these 12 points that are shared by these authors, do you believe that these measures are good ways to deal with and combat misinformation? And if so, what are the particular strategies or points of these 12 strategies that you find especially useful? And if not, what's missing here, right? What would be a better way to deal with and make sure that the information that we have is correct? And then secondarily, I'd like your group to think about a public health issue other than COVID-19 and how some of these points or suggestions might be designed to educate the public and address misinformation on this topic as well. So kind of giving us the opportunity to apply and start to think about these strategies. So it looks like we've got 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. So we have 11 folks. So let's do one group of 5 and one group of 6. So we'll do 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 over here. So take some time. Have one person who can write or type for your group. The previous slide, which is on Canvas, has those 12 points as well. They're also listed in the article for you to refer back to. If it's showing up oddly on your device too, I can. It'd be easier for you all if I had it on this slide or this one. This one? Okay. Yeah, gotcha. Yeah.
I like it.
So go ahead and wrap up your discussion and be ready to share here. All right. So I heard some good discussion from both of the groups regarding sort of addressing these questions here. So I'd like to hear from each of the two groups talking about, first of all, this plan, whether or not you feel like it's a good way to deal with misinformation. If so, what's persuasive? If not, what's missing? And then the public health issue that you all talked about outside of COVID-19 and how you might be able to address that using what we've talked about. Start here in the back. Yeah. Thanks for sharing and getting us thinking about this, Christy. I think that the way that, for instance, we talk about sort of minority versus disadvantage versus, I've also heard terminology used to describe like historically resilient or historically underrepresented. Like that type of language is important if we're thinking about how to engage in culture and identity and a range of issues, right? There's a lot of ways that language is constantly evolving and changing that I think can better represent and support the needs of a variety of people, right? So I think that's something that's really good to really note there. I think, you know, in talking about HIV/AIDS and support, right, the idea of empathic communication, of really not treating something like HIV as like a death or end of somebody and their well-being, but instead in talking positively about how to have a meaningful life, right? Also, I like the suggestion here about educating from a young age, right? There's been, you know, a lot of discussion and focus on what it means to provide sort of exposure and information, right, on topics. We've talked, we thought about like kind of historically about how certain scientific information is taught in schools, how things such as sex education are talked about in schools, right? Those kind of topics and the ways that those topics are addressed, sort of the social, political ramifications of those things are really enmeshed and intertwined with the way that we communicate with younger generations and potentially promote healthy behaviors from a younger age. Right? And then let's hear from the group here in the front.
So we thought that overall, the 1.5 was a good way to come back to this information. We think that things that could be added with just be whether it's adding to a current point or making another one is finding ways to address all sides and issues and angles of whatever the for the topic of in this case COVID-19 rather than this one. Because if there's like they're only addressing one issue or one part of it, people on the other side might not be inclined to listen and vice versa. And it's just we thought it would help with like credibility if we took the time to look at like all views. And then this was something that we thought would be not necessarily like realistic, but it would be good if there is a way that we can filter all information through like a single portal or a single website. So in a perfect world, we would have that.
Sure.
I think that so developing educational material and each issue of evidence-based science to address existing questions and all of that. We thought that was really strong, especially because a lot of this information can and does get shared on social media. And regardless if everyone, many people are on some form of social media, and even if they're not, they're likely watching the news or getting information from websites, and a lot of times those are also sharing the exact same information, or they'll directly share like this is something that's been spreading around on Instagram or Twitter. And then other issue that we decided on was sexual health. Kind of specifically like the outbreak, STI outbreak in France. And so we thought that really good use would be number 7, so like impactful communication. Number 8, promoting dialogue around the issue to understand people's perceptions. Number 9, just discussing personal experiences on social media to help increase stigma and educate. And then number 11, again, developing educational material. And then like at THD, they have like where they're promoting a lot of like mental health things, and they're having like free drive-in clinics and testings, and they're having like little events to teach people about like being safe.
Yeah, absolutely. I really like the thorough job, Macy, that you and your group did in regarding the sort of 12 points here, right? I think that it seems like both groups believe that educational materials and support, especially from a young age, is super useful and helpful, right? That healthy behavior are learned, and the sooner we develop that information, the more that we can incorporate it just as a habit in our lives, right? I also like sort of the observation that, when we talk about persuasion and communication, we're talking about this in frames, right? That oftentimes the values and beliefs that people have across different social and political views mean that when we make arguments, that oftentimes outside of that frame of view, it's a lot harder to persuade somebody because their entire premise or approach or way of thinking about an issue is very different, right? If you're trying to convey information, for instance, from an expert or like from an organization like the CDC, right? One critique that could come is from somebody that believes that that organization is not trustworthy, right? And as a result, is unwilling to sort of hear that perspective. Or if an article is shared that comes from a news source that's seen as politically biased, right? The response to that is probably going to be not as strong either. And so thinking about ways to sort of almost communicate within a frame that you disagree with can be something that can work, right? Or to try to appeal to sort of a universally shared set of views or values is something that that might work as a strategy. And I like that I'm talking about sort of STIs, an outbreak in the grant, right? And the measures used to educate the public on issues. Obviously, there is a lot of misinformation surrounding, sort of ways of treatment and support related to STIs. For instance, in what ways certain STIs can be transmitted, what medical interventions or treatment are available, and so on, are definitely things that are super important to educate people about, and things that connect really well to the categories that we have here. So good job here in talking through and focusing on these two. So, this article, I think, does a good job of talking about how we communicate about information and ensure the accuracy of information online. The other article on inquiring minds from Dobransky and Hargati is a lot more straightforward. So I want to go over it just a little bit of detail and some of the key points to know here. What this article adds to our discussion is more about how we receive and use information online, right? The idea being that, yes, there's a lot of information, including misinformation online. However, it's also important to situate how and why we seek out information. It should be noted that this article is also about 10 years old, right? So I think that our use of information seeking behavior online has definitely increased by a lot. One of the ideas that gets brought up from this article is what's known as healthy lifestyle theory. And this is a theory that essentially people make different decisions regarding their health based on what we consider to be their lifestyle. And what might constitute their lifestyle could be the resources that are available to them, could be the importance that they see of addressing or dealing with health issues, and also things like social factors and influence, right? For instance, you might be familiar with the idea of a food desert, right? Or a location in which access to affordable and healthy food is not readily accessible. That could be one example. Or if you find that you're oftentimes getting fast food, that could be because you enjoy it. It can also be because it's more affordable. It can also be because of time. If you're really busy as a student, if you're juggling a lot between classes, work you might be doing, and extracurriculars, it is a very available option, right? When I was in college, I drank enough energy drinks that I'm surprised that my heart's still doing okay, right? Like the lifestyle or approach that we might take at different points in our life are definitely major factors that can impact how we engage in health-related issues, right? So this is a theory that suggests that we adopt sort of agentically and circumstantially a set of behaviors. One thing to think about too is the extent to which things like smoking or the use of drugs recreationally were in sort of your household, right? There is a good chance that somebody is more likely to be a smoker if they grew up with friends or in a household where smoking was common, right? Also, right, dealing with stress, anxiety, or related conditions are also a factor. So what this theory suggests is that we adopt a sort of set of practices and habits that are associated with the options that are available to us and also the decisions that we make about perceived importance. So there are a few things that we do know that I think this article helps us to contextualize and think about as we're thinking about health information online. One of them is that it should come as no surprise that people who are, one, younger, and two, more educated tend to more actively seek health information online, right? So this oftentimes is due to access to online resources, the perception that online sources are a good way to receive information about health, and also that we might have access to greater vocabulary and resources that allow making decisions about health, right? Oftentimes, socioeconomic disparities, for instance, the relationship between education and income, right, can oftentimes impact access to health information. If you are not able to receive a sort of living income, then you're less likely to be seeking out actively health information. You might think back to sort of the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? The idea that there are basic survival, shelter type of needs that you have, and that if meeting those needs is much more challenging, that there are fewer resources available to kind of move up the hierarchy. Lower socioeconomic status, right, as well as higher age are associated with poor health. Of course, as we get older, we might encounter greater health challenges, but also the idea, again, as we've talked about a lot in this class, socioeconomic status is a really major indicator of health, that there are access to fewer resources, that doing something like going to a doctor's appointment is more expensive, that an employer might not have insurance available, that the cost of premiums or the quality of insurance could not be particularly great, and also that the sort of costs of attending and participating in something like a doctor's visit can also be prohibitive if those are hours that you're losing to make ends meet. And also that in order to receive benefits of health information online, we have to have a good and stable internet connection to do so. And there are still many parts of the world and many parts of the United States where access to the internet and also the costs with accessing the internet are not readily available. So this study is kind of interesting because in sort of assessing how we receive information about health online, the study was actually done of about 1,000 college students. So there's a limitation here in terms of age and some of the demographics here, right? Most of the people were 18, some were 19, and very few were 20 or older. Some demographic differences, including about 40% were white, and some differences here in representation. And also look at things such as health status. Most ranked as fairly good, and also a context in which a lot of their families had some level of education as well. So sort of based on this data set, it is the people that were surveyed and assessed for this study. So I think it's useful to situate and keep that in mind. That didn't include a lot of older participants, that the demographics did have some diversity, but there were, some things that are not being fully represented. So one thing that I find especially interesting about this piece and about, again, kind of acknowledging the demographic changes and trends and how we seek out health information. So this article differentiates between how we receive information about treatment, right? Treatment being specific interventions for health, and lifestyle being more about day-to-day things that we might do when we're not in a crisis or significant situation. And as we notice, right, that the usage of online sources like websites are consistently seen as the most common. A little bit more common for something like treatment, right? I've had this surgery, I need a second opinion, but also that for lifestyle. And then coming in at number 2 is friends and family, right? So oftentimes, especially for younger generations, we might seek out the support of friends and family who have gone through similar challenges to us, or to get additional opinions on health and science related topics. And so it's interesting that a medical professional is sought more for treatment than lifestyle. We put more credibility or attention there. Also interesting that the use of newspaper, radio, TV, etc., is more common for lifestyle than it is for treatment. That oftentimes the usage of something like magazines and sort of like publications or commercials or that sort of thing are telling us how to live our lives more day to day over something like specific medication. Although we do occasionally get those TV ads that have this laundry list of side effects of taking a medication sometimes, right? So interesting kind of variation here. And I would bet that the usage of online sources among college students has drastically increased. And I would also guess that the usage of something like newspaper, magazine, et cetera, has gone down. Although I could be wrong, it'd be worth testing and exploring further. So what I want you to do is sort of given this piece and some of the findings here, just take some time in your groups to chat a little bit about health, right? And the ways that you typically receive health information. For instance, the sources that you might typically use to gather information about health. For instance, maybe you find yourself regularly checking social media, maybe you're subscribed to a magazine or a video series or something like that. How do you normally seek out information? And make sure to give the opportunity for everybody in the group to share and talk about that a little bit. And then I want you secondarily to think about in your group some of the ways that we might address disparities and inequalities related to accessing information about health online too. So feel free to return to the groups you were working with earlier and take some time to chat about these questions.
Most of the time, it's like, I don't look at the word of mouth. And it's serious enough. I like some, you're trying to find some kind of revenue on that site or something. A lot of times with COVID, it's they probably have to have their own filter that will trust them. Sheer volume of information, the fact that you can't count on anyone believing or trusting anyone.
Stick take about 2 more minutes to chat about this. So, at least on the lull in conversation, sounds like folks are about done here. So I'm curious on this first question, if people found there was largely agreement, or if people got their information from different sources. So here on this side, what did you all notice? Where did you all get your health information typically? Mhm.
But when they shared it, everyone was like, oh yeah, I
Hmm.
that. So they were like, scholarly articles in journals like related to school things, so you have to look and research,
Mhm.
you're inherently getting information from that. Finding things on social media and then researching it on community. And going to like, storage websites.
Mhm.
And then through word of mouth, CHB and like the local resources. Textbooks for school and homework for like those classes or like
Mhm.
health information. Advertisements or flyers on campus and then like RAs in the dorm sharing information. Events, like nursing from
Mhm.
headlocks and then student info line at the school.
Yeah, yeah. So that's interesting. I think I was hearing like you all were like, Justice brought up TED Talks, and people were like, yeah, we do that. Like, a lot of examples of things that we don't necessarily think about, but that we realize, hey, all this information or constitute things that we use to access health information, right? EOU info line is one I hadn't even thought of, but that is another good example, right? There's things related to COVID-19 updates, policy, case rates in the area, and so on that get shared too. What did you all notice in terms of how your group members receive information?
Like Google stuff.
Yeah.
We were all just like.
Yeah. Yeah. Sure.
And then two. I guess try to like define your because you could say like sex education.
Yeah. So, interesting kind of thinking back to kind of the approach a lot of us have to health. Things are working, if stuff is going normally, it's like not something that comes to mind. Like we don't really think about it all that much unless something comes up or we're dealing with symptoms, right? So that is a pretty common experience. When you were mentioning, Kiana, ties back to this idea of intersectionality, right? The idea that when we're talking about issues of health disparities and access, that it is these sort of multiple and overlapping elements. So when we think about things such as access to sex education, right, there's a lot of things that are coming into play about whether or not that access is available. First of all, what kind of information is being given as it relates to things like gender, sexuality, and so on, right? Historically, a lot of sort of sex education has been a lot of information about sexual health for people assigned male at birth, less so for people assigned female, and even less so for folks who are intersex, trans, and kind of within categories that might not be discussed as frequently. Also things like economic access and opportunities, right? And just an array of things that could impact the quality and access of that information too. And then what did you all on this side talk about in terms of addressing disparities online?
So I think for us, we kind of like
Mhm. Mhm.
And so we discussed like having advertisements or flyers posted like around campus,
Mhm.
around town, or someone said that they got safer, there's like there is or used to be like a bulletin board and you can
Mhm.
post things on there.
Mhm.
And I think that's a good idea because we figured everyone, most people will go to a grocery store for food, right?
Sure, sure.
And so like having those things accessible, even if it's just like on a table right in the door, I think that would be so big.
Yeah.
And then just having like free community events, like the one that we did.
Yeah.
It's a way to get that information out to the public without requiring them to have like financial means or internet.
Yeah, I really like the suggestion that there are alternatives to online sources, something like bulletin boards or common spaces, such that people can access information from a variety of channels and modalities. There's also the sort of sensory element of it too. You see a bulletin board face to face and it might resonate with you more. Even if we have access to online information, there's just so much to have to sift through and figure out that oftentimes providing it in a face-to-face way or in an alternative format can just make the information clearer and can stand out to us better, right? All good examples here of the ways that we address disparities online and also how we're accessing information about health too. So to wrap up the key points we've talked about today, we talked about the infodemic piece and the idea that there are challenges with public trust, with accurate information online, in a variety of ways in which misinformation and disinformation can impact. We've definitely seen it with COVID-19, but we continue to see that with a lot of other health and medical related issues that are important for us to think about in terms of finding accurate information for ourselves and providing accurate information to others. We talked about some of the challenges, ethics and credibility, which are definitely important elements for us to think about as we're communicating about health. And then also the idea that many of us are using online information to talk about health and related issues. So as we go into next week, we've started to talk a little bit about public approaches, but we'll talk a lot more about health and science in public context and engaging with the public. Next week, I'm actually going to have you read a co-authored piece that I did with some colleagues, and I'm hoping I can rope one of my co-authors in on Zoom to join us, but we'll see if they're able to make it. So we'll be talking about public approaches to health and science. Definitely for this week, be thinking about your presentation since it is coming up in terms of what topic you want to focus on and how you might prepare to talk about health-related disparities. So go ahead and either pass forward or email your group's work for today with your group members' names on it. Have a great rest of your afternoon. Again, it's Oregon. Thanks. It's Oregon. I have no idea what the weather's going to do this evening. So safe travels wherever you go the rest of the day. Yeah, thanks, Stacey.